Welcome, folks, to our second of the two-part series on our Changing the Conversation webinar. And welcome in to the folks who are just joining us for the first time. If you were here with us last week, welcome for the first time. We're just going to be covering more about the fantastic Changing the Conversation podcast that is put on by C4 Innovations and sometimes co-sponsored by MHTTC, which is the organization putting on today's event. So I'll go through our beginning slides that we do before all events, and then we'll get started in to hear from our fantastic hosts, Ashley Stewart and Ronnie Hodges. I don't know why I just did that. Weirdly, I say your name all the time. Anyway, we will get started in just a little bit, but we will start off with our standard beginnings. So microphones are going to be muted during today's presentation. Closed captioning is available for the event. Click on the closed captioning CC icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen to select a transcription option. The webinar is also being recorded. I just checking that pause was also me checking that I have it recorded, and it is happening. So slides in the video archive of today's event will be emailed to participants and featured on the MHTTC website. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit your question via the chat box. The host will share your question with speakers for a live response during the Q&A portion of the event. You might even get your question answered sooner because Ashley and Ronnie are incredibly responsive hosts. So throw your questions out at any time and let us know your thoughts. Also, if you have questions after the session, please email newengland@mhttcnetwork.org. We can get back to you, answer any of your questions about MHTTC and the work that we do. And then also we'll be sharing the contact information for Dr. Stewart and for Ronnie after this event, so you can also catch up with them. Our traditional disclaimers. Our funding comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The views and opinions expressed in today's session are those of presenters and moderators, not SAMHSA. As well, the language that we use here at the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network uses person-centered, affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities during this session. Please ensure that whatever you're contributing to our discussion, that you use language that is affirming, respectful, and strengths-based. Also, as a committed ally, the New England MHTTC network recognizes that the New England area is home to the ancestral land of many Native tribes. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we acknowledge that all places our distributed staff live and work, as well as where we provide services and hold events, are Indigenous lands. Myself, Leela Carty, I'll be doing technical support for today's event. I reside on Nipmuc, Pecumtuck, and Wabanaki Confederacy land in the hills of Western Massachusetts. And I welcome you taking a look and getting a little bit of an understanding of where you yourself are residing. And if you haven't already looked it up, I will put the nativeland.ca. That is the website that you can look up and find more about where you're located. Oh. I skipped ahead. All right. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to transition us over to our hosts. Like I added earlier, our hosts are Dr. Ashley Stewart and Ronnie Hodges. So handing this over to both of you, thank you so much for joining us. And please feel free, folks, to send any messages in the chat, any issues that you are experiencing, and I will happily handle those alongside today's presentation. So thank you again, and we will transition over to hear from Ronnie and Ashley.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us again. Ashley and Ronnie here reporting in. We mentioned and we asked you all last time, what were some of the things that you would be particularly interested in talking about or getting from this discussion around the podcast? And while we gave the context about our thoughts about how we developed the podcast, what were some of the considerations that we had around developing a podcast last time, we also recognize that navigating difficult conversations is an essential part of this process and this journey. And we also recognize that many folks shared that you'd want to learn more about that. So Ronnie and I will be talking about navigating difficult discussions. So we typically navigate from different rules of the road, or maybe even some critical conversation pieces. And these are, we're going to go through them in more depth, but they're essentially ways of engaging in difficult conversation. We're going to spend some time with each of them. As we go through them, we're hoping for participation from the group, that you could share ways that you've seen this, you haven't seen it done well, or maybe if you have any clarifying questions. So we're going to start with this first one about expecting a lack of closure. When having and engaging in difficult conversations, it's important to recognize that while closure is nice, it might not always happen in a conversation. There might be opportunities for the conversation to continue to unfold. If we're talking about equity related topics more specifically, we might observe that as we have the conversations, more questions continue to populate. And I'll ask Ronnie in just a moment to talk a little bit about how we'll start a conversation before in the podcast, and then by the time we get to the podcast, we have even more topics. That is recognizing that we're rolling with and moving forward with a conversation that doesn't have a nice bow tied on at the end. There might be more things to discuss. There might be more things to process through. And that's a beautiful part of the journey in navigating difficult conversations. So Ronnie, I mentioned that, we tend to do the podcast in two parts. How have you seen there not be a nice bow, but in fact, the conversation evolved?
Yeah, I think I like to manage, it's about managing expectations in the process. So having that kind of open-endedness leads us down a path that's unexpected, which brings us happy conversations in the process. As Ashley mentioned before, we'll start talking about something before the podcast, and then it'll spin to something else during the podcast. But I think when you are able to manage the expectation of having like a period on something, as opposed to putting commas there. So it's always nice to put a comma, because you may think of something else that may enhance what you're trying to say. You may have a different thought. And it's not always going to be a bow put on it. It's like when you end a conversation with somebody, that's not the last time you're going to toss them like, whatever I said today, that's it. Like there's going to be more to come from that. So it's the same kind of thing when you're doing this. You expect there to be something else beyond this. And I think when you open yourself up to that, it makes the conversation flow smoother, and you don't feel like you have to have all the answers right then.
Okay. Yeah. Any thoughts from folks listening or joining in about, what Ronnie just said and being intentional about changing our expectations of how conversations will unfold? Feel welcome to put them in the chat as well. If you're typing, please continue to type. Don't backspace because I went to the next slide. This whole conversation is in the theme. So if you're typing something and we move on to another slide, please continue to type it because it will be relevant. And in engaging in difficult conversations, we also want to share, the opportunity to ask for clarification. There's 15 of us in this room, whether it's 15 people, whether it's 500 people, asking for clarification is a really important topic, an important thing to do with any given topic. When we're having difficult conversations and we're having them in such a live and ever-present way, there's the reality that we might be using terms differently. And when we're using terms differently, it could create a space for miscommunication, misinterpretation, or even just some sentiments that show up around the terms. And so we like to create a space where we can ask for clarification, where I might say, I noticed that you keep using this particular term, Ronnie, that sounds a little bit different than how I'm using it. I'm wondering how you're using it. Now that opportunity to ask for clarification can help to create a way that a path in which the conversation progresses more positively and more thoughtfully and more intentionally than if we're using different terms and end up having different conversations. So asking for clarification is a really big and important component of having difficult and managing difficult conversations. Embracing discomfort. Now, I don't know about you all, but a lot of times when I have conversations, people are evading discomfort. People don't want to be uncomfortable. And in fact, people do as much as they can to not be in discomforting situations. And discomfort tends to be associated with negative emotions. And also, I can't think of any time where growth has happened, where something hasn't been stretched or churned or pulled in order for that growth to occur. So growth is inherently discomforting in some respect. And so sometimes we'll go into critical or conversations not expecting discomfort, and it emerges, and naturally that makes us want to shut down. But by embracing discomfort, leaning into that discomfort and recognizing that that might be an indicative of a growth moment, is really helpful in producing meaningful, fruitful conversations. Any thoughts from folks on that topic?
Oh, I'll just say it's like being an emotional chiropractor. Like it hurts, you gotta pop it, but once that pop happens, like you embrace it, you feel much better after. So you just kind of sit through it and deal with it and work out the kinks so you can get to the other side of that.
That's good. That's good. Also very relatable. I like that example. Another strategy for engaging equity-centered and potentially difficult conversations is to recognize that this work is for us, not for others. A lot of times when we have these conversations, people will engage and they'll say, oh, this is good, or I hope this person heard this, or we'll think of different people to share with, which is important. We want to share knowledge that we gain and share knowledge that we have. Equally as important is to recognize that this work is for all of us. And so, I teach courses on institutionalized forms of racism. I have a course that focuses on deconstructing white supremacy and social work, whether we're training on topics around racial trauma, gender-based trauma, gender-based violence, inequities around recovery and housing. I mean, these are all topics and conversations that we have pretty much on a daily basis. And sometimes folks will say, yeah, let's get this information so we can distribute it to folks, but aren't necessarily locked in or present for themselves. And when we're having a conversation, whether that's on a podcast or on a platform in terms of a training, recognizing that the work is for every single person in the room is essential. Now, we're all starting at different points, different levels, different backgrounds, and it's important to recognize that that journey was going to inevitably look different. However, this work is for all of us to do. And if that's maybe looking at how to support someone better in having difficult conversations, recognizing something that brings up discomfort for us so that we can develop better strategies to lean into those types of difficult conversations, this is work for us. And so, yeah, I'm wondering, do folks ever see that? Do you ever engage in a difficult conversation and the response or the sentiment that you feel, whether it's from people at your organization, feels more dismissive, as in like, oh, well, we'll leave it to that committee or that group to resolve? Anyone ever see that or experience that at all? Maybe. Honor all experiences and expertise, recognizing they come in many different forms. Now, this one's particularly interesting because you have experience, you have expertise. When I talk about experience, a lot of times people think that we're referring to like learned knowledge, right? Like I have a lot of experience doing this work. I have a lot of experience, you know, with this form of scholarship. But we are also embracing, enhancing, or prioritizing, naming, putting paramount lived expertise. So when we're talking about navigating difficult conversations or managing difficult conversations, there's a component of it that it's lived for folks. And we want to try to get to the truth of it. Even if we're having a conversation, me and Ronnie are having a conversation about an experience that we don't know, there might be a moment where we have some critical reflection and say, hey, neither of us have lived experience with this. And so we might have studied it, we might have researched a little bit about it, we have some knowledge of it, but to get that expertise, that lived experience in the room is so essential. And so it might come or look in different forms, but this is all about embracing authenticity, right? So if we're going to be embracing authenticity, it's really important to bring in lived experience and expertise, and it's going to change the conversation in ways that we can't even imagine. Beyond that, it might also invoke the reality that we're having a conversation that might be inappropriately situated. Right? It might be inappropriately situated. Why we're having a conversation about experiences that we know nothing about. And so that's an opportunity for inclusion, to bring people into the conversation who have that lived expertise, or I might know about it from this theoretical level, which is beautiful and important and critical. But what does it look like applied day in and day out? So we want to bring in people's expertise through lived experience. Ronnie, I know you all do a lot with lived expertise and lived experience in the work that you do.
Yeah, it's central to the work we do, because you can't create solutions without getting closest to those, and that information from those who are closest to being involved in the problem, experiencing what the sticking points, what the issues are on a real frontline level. So without the expertise, you're really just making up stuff pie in the sky. So it's very important to honor that expertise in the many forms that it comes in, lived and living.
Yeah. That distinction is really important, lived and living. And some people I have heard that language kind of change. You know, Ronnie's really intentional about saying lived and living, because some people might have experienced it and it's a part of their identity, or it's part of something that they experienced in the past. And there's some folks who are actively in it, and that brings different and unique and both important types of expertise. So I just want to highlight that really important distinction Ronnie made. We also want to create safe and brave spaces. There are a lot of things that I'm thinking of an example that when we've had conversations where things have been really comforting for me to talk about, but required a little bit of bravery on the part of other people. And then there are opportunities where something has been really comfortable for someone to bring up, and I'm sitting there like squirming in my seat because it is requiring a level of bravery from it. So it's important to acknowledge and embrace both. That there might be conversations we have that feel really safe to us. There might be conversations that we have that require a level of bravery. This one's one of my favorites. This one is to revisit topics and ideas. So we come from a culture where you're expected to kind of have instantaneous responses. Someone asks you a question, you should have an answer. And it's kind of the call and response kind of culture. it's fostered very young. I like to think about when we're in school and someone asks you a question, you expect to be called on. And if you're not called on, then you might sit back anxiously and wait until kind of the teacher decides who they're going to call on to answer the question, and hope it's not you, or hope it is you. But we've come from a very call and response culture, which is good. It allows us to engage meaningful and dialogue and discussion, but it also has an influence that would require us to feel like we have to have instantaneous responses. So revisiting welcome really honors and acknowledges that it honors and acknowledges that some of us process information differently. So you might be in a situation or in a space where you're processing, and then it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're like, my goodness, that's what I wanted to say. That's the point that I wanted to make. Or it might look like the next day you're like, actually, I had a question about that. Some of us process questions and respond immediately, and some of us take some time to think about it. When we're having difficult conversations, a lot of times it's the expectation that it all gets resolved in that moment. It's the expectation that we all have instantaneous responses. But if we're really going to lean into this idea or this concept of having meaningful or dynamic, difficult conversation, there has to also be the critical space where we lean in. And we allow someone to bring something back after they've had time to marinate on it, to think about it, to process it, to reduce the anxiety that we have to have perfect responses. But in fact, we might connect and put different pieces of the puzzle together, and that creates its own kind of full response. So we want to create a space where revisiting is welcome, where people can come back to the table the next day, or, in that same week, or whenever the time's appropriate. Say, we started having this conversation and it made me think of this. And then I'd be, why are they bringing that back up? But instead saying, I'm so glad that you brought it back up, because there's components of it that we need to process more. That's a really, different way of kind of looking at creating a space. And if you're trying to be intentional about facilitating an environment where critical conversations can happen, you might even create that space by naming it and saying, hey, is there anything that we talked about or anything that has come up throughout this week that folks want to revisit, so that people know that it's okay to process, to think, and to come back to topics. Let's say you see something inequitable happen, or something happens or said in a conversation and it sits with you, but you don't know how to respond. So you do maybe an awkward laugh, or you let it go, but afterwards you're like, that was really not okay. This rule to revisit, this opportunity to come back to topics, also allows Rodney to say, hey, Ashley, when we had that conversation the other day, you mentioned this. And Ashley, at the moment I laughed because I was kind of startled by it, but I also wanted to come back and talk to it a bit more, because I think there's something else there. That's the rule to revisit. That's the ability to come back and to circle back to things after we've had a chance to process. Yeah, I love it. Mia puts in the chat that all these topics really put you in the mind of setting boundaries. And I see a lot of people emphasizing that as well. Right? These difficult conversations have to come from a place of wellness, and boundaries is absolutely a part of that. Managing expectations, to Ronnie's point, absolutely a part of that. Thank you. Affirm and give credit. We want to support one another. We want to affirm one another. We want to give credit to one another. Like Maya put that in the chat, and other people affirmed it. In having difficult conversations, we want to create a space where people can be affirmed. So I really said Maya. That was a great point. Because in difficult conversations, there's still the room for affirmation. There's still the room for giving credit. I love what Lee just said. That was so good. I'm so grateful that Lee brought that into the space, creating the affirmations, right? Someone might say, hey, Kevin, that point that you made in our meeting last week, or that point that you made earlier was really important, and I wanted to come back to it. Maybe Eloise said something dynamic in a previous meeting, and you had a chance to process it, and you want to come back to it. All of these things are important in navigating and having difficult conversations. Thoughts, questions? Revoke expert position. Recognizing many of you in this room are a lot of pressures put on you each and every day to have answers, to be an expert, to be a leader in the work that you do. And sometimes in difficult conversations, that expectation still feels like it's on us. Sometimes I like to go into conversations, even on things that I'm quote an expert in, or I have my SME, my subject matter expertise in. I like to say, I have a lot of knowledge, but there's still so much around any given topic to still know. And so the ability to revoke expert positioning allows us to engage in difficult conversations in a more transparent, authentic way. It also relieves us of any expectations to have everything perfectly formulated. But more specifically, it creates a space of inclusion where everyone feels like they can participate or engage, no matter what their level of knowledge of the topic is beforehand. Not everyone's going to know the same amount or share the same ideas, and that's part of the process too. We want to listen to understand, not to respond. When I was in school, they used to call it a loaded gun response. I don't use that anymore because I do a lot of trauma work and it just feels inappropriate. But essentially what the theory is really wrapping itself around is that when someone says something to you, you start to automatically formulate your response back so you can have something to say in response rather quickly. Now, that's a normal cognitive function, and also it sometimes allows us to not hear the fullness of what someone's sharing. So someone's telling you something, and in the back of your mind, you're trying to remember to say, when they stop talking, I'm going to have to remind them that it was actually this day and not that day. But everything that's said after it was heard, but maybe not in its fullness. It requires a stretch of even a part of our comfort where you might feel as though you'll forget something. We have to release that desire to have a perfectly formulated response when other person stops talking, to embrace the discomfort of silence, to give the self a moment to think and to pause and to breathe before responding. Yeah, it is hard. When I say sometimes listening is the best response. Absolutely. And if we really get into it, you could get into some trauma-informed responses, which are important in difficult conversations. I don't even know what to say, but I'm glad that you told me, right? That is a response too. So to my point, just listening is in itself a full and complete response. We're not all going to agree. I don't even know if that's ever the goal, but it is to be able to hear people in fullness, that we can respond appropriately to the multiple components of what someone's saying. Any thoughts? Accountability is kind. So I like to think about this, as when you're going into a difficult conversation, identifying what is that common ground. So, for example, when we're doing a podcast, we just did a podcast on gender affirming care. The common ground is that we want to reduce harm as it relates to people being able to get care and quality of care. Our ideas about what that might look like might be different, but the foundational goal is we want people to be able to receive care without harm. And so accountability begins to respond to the natural fear that many of us have in navigating difficult conversations, where you're afraid that someone might call you out, or sometimes even referred to as call people in. And so you're afraid of saying the wrong thing. Accountability kind of really reframes that, so that if I'm having a conversation about something and there's a mutual ground, like when Ronnie says to me, "Hey, Ashley, I know you really care about making sure that racial inequities are addressed in gender affirming care. I'm not sure if you noticed, but when you use this language, it really, people perked up a little bit, or it looked like it might not have landed well for other people." That's a very kind thing for Ronnie to do. It's kind because it took a lot of courage for Ronnie to name that for me, to bring that into the space, to create that opportunity for accountability for me. It's kind for me to receive that, as Ronnie seeing my intentions and seeing my desire to reduce harm and providing me the opportunity to take accountability. It's also kind to a third group, and that third group that it's kind to are the folks who potentially I might not harm by using that language again. So we really begin to think about, what does it look like when something is said to address it? It actually can be a very kind thing to do, on a multitude of different levels. And so accountability can be very kind. Ronnie, have you seen how like call out or call in culture be done really well, or shut down different conversations?
Yes, I think sometimes people just respond to things, and it goes back to the one you just said before that. Like, people just respond to things and just say something and don't really take into account how what they're saying may impact someone else. So I've seen people say, you just said this, you said it pretty quickly. So can you tell me more? Can you unpack that a little more? So I can make sure I'm clear about what you're saying, and, giving people the opportunity to like kind of sit and think and say, hey, okay, I could see how you might have took it this way, but this is what I actually meant. Like, giving people that space without saying, now I know you didn't just say this, and just, going off on someone, or, being harsh with it, but being able to say, hey, you just said this, and I just want to make sure I understand where you're coming from before I respond to what you just said.
I love that framing. That's so good. Mhm. And it also empowers us because we feel like more of us feel like we could do what Ronnie did, or say, hey, I just want to bring this to your attention. More of us feel confident in being able to do that than stopping a meeting and be like, this thing just happened, right? But the inequity that occurred needs to be addressed. So it's about finding an approach that really works with your style, your communication structure, so you can address things. The most challenging thing we could do is to not do anything. The most challenging internally thing that we can do is to walk away from a situation and then think about how we didn't respond at all. So finding ways to respond that allow us to do so meaningfully and in our own voice is important. Give yourself grace and be gentle. How many folks struggle with this? It can be really hard to be gentle with yourself and to give yourself grace. I use myself as an example, as someone who's studied microaggressions, not only contemporary, but the history of microaggressions, and so much so that I've been able to have the opportunity to write about it, and work with some of the individuals who kind of formulated the theories around microaggressions. I remember times when I've said something that was rooted in bias and absolutely landed as a microaggression. The only thing I wanted to do was stand on the table. Like, no. I know microaggressions. Like, I know microaggressions for a fact. But the reality of it is that the harm had occurred, and focusing on myself or what I meant or what I didn't mean only exacerbated the situation. Instead, it was a critical assessment of what was the bias that even allowed that response or that action to occur, and how do I ensure that I address this so that it doesn't happen again. I know that I have good intentions, and I knew that I that people's care is most paramount to me, and also I caused harm, and so all I could do, or all I should have done in the moment, was to take accountability, make sure I understood it, so make sure it doesn't happen again, and then create space for the folks who were potentially harmed, because that's the priority in the moment. So, but in order to do that, it required a level of grace to say, I can confront this, I can address this. I didn't get it perfect, and I'm still a person who's committed to this issue. All those things are true. We cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. Acknowledge so that we can challenge things is so important. I'm pretty sure Lee was the one who kind of drew my attention to this quote here. You know, the quote of "we cannot challenge, we cannot acknowledge." Yeah, that was you, Lee. We cannot challenge, we cannot acknowledge is a very popular quote. And, you know, I heard it from the likes of Kimberly Crenshaw, who, for those who are familiar, is really influential and foundational, seminal in talking about intersectionality. Google will also say it was a quote from Dr. Phil. We're unsure exactly who said it. However, the theme of it, the sentiment of it, well exceeds all of these particular examples. And, you know, in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So when we think about, okay, is this a good time to bring something to a conversation, or if we're having a difficult conversation, sometimes the starting place is just to acknowledge something, but we aren't able to challenge it unless if we're skirting around, pivoting, or kind of avoiding a topic. Bring it to the table. Say, we really need to talk about, you know, this comment that was made, this action that occurred, this policy that leaves people out. We have to acknowledge it so we can challenge it. Thoughts? You know, folks, a moment in case someone's typing or trying to unmute. If you are typing or attempting to unmute, please let us know so we can get you set up. And even as we go into the next slide, if you are typing, please continue to type your thought out. One of the things we want to do in moving this forward is to really look at it from an ecological space. Thank you, I really like that saying, which reminds me of past trauma and why I faced it was by doing a trauma timeline. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that example to space and sharing with us. Yeah, you have to be able to acknowledge it, to challenge it. And so doing that timeline is a really dynamic way. And just to relay, you know, and connect even something you said that pops an idea for me, that might be something that folks can do in groups, is to say, let's go back through the sequence of events or things that have happened. Where did this gap really start, or where did the miscommunication really start on our team? And then utilize that to create a more inclusive environment. So I appreciate that example. Thank you. So in ecology is a branch of science that's concerned with the interconnectedness of the interrelationships of organisms and their environments, aka people and environments. My favorite part of the definition of an ecology is that it's delicate, intricate, and often complex. And so one of the things that we want to acknowledge is that people and environments are delicate, complex, and as we navigate difficult conversations, we recognize that people in their environments can be complex. We want to understand the fullness of it. And that leads us to a space of really starting with inquisition. We might know that we're talking about a topic that is not part of our lived experience or expertise. And we know that we don't want to speak for other people, but we can really begin to leverage our understanding of people and environment to encourage and call in a different type of conversation. That might look like me saying, hey, we're having this conversation about if and how and when to make this building more accessible. However, there are people with disabilities who need to be able to access it. And so us having this conversation about if we're going to do it is one that, you know, really creates an issue for me. And as a result, I think it's really important that we talk to people who have had this experience to ensure that we get it right the first time. That's not speaking for other people and saying, oh, I know these folks and these folks need this or that, but it's instead saying, I'm going to create a platform for this conversation to be had, for the things to be acknowledged so that we can challenge it. And I find that sometimes people are more comfortable coming from this place of like, what are you observing? What are you seeing? And what do you think, you know, is being overlooked in the conversation? And that's advocating from the space of yourself, of advocating for yourself. And by doing that, creating a space to really create the space to say who's not being included and why. Another strategy that we use when thinking about how to facilitate difficult conversation is thinking about the work of Dr. Ken Hardy. Dr. Ken Hardy has the task of the privileged and subjugated. So in light of acknowledging and challenging things, it's also important to realize that we have and occupy both subjugated and privileged identities in our lives. So the generic tasks for us to all consider is to be an expert in our own experiences, not of others, not to speak for people, to create the space for people to tell their stories, and to make space for both thoughts and feelings. So these are the generic tasks. Dr. Ken Hardy then goes into talking about the tasks of the privileged and tasks of the subjugated. Now, there are a few of these that I think really stand out. We'll go through them. I would love to hear from you all which ones really stand out to you as well. The first is to resist this false notions of equality. It's not helpful to equate suffering. I like to break this down a little bit more because oftentimes this looks like, from really well-intended responses, as empathy. You ever talk to someone or are having a conversation and it's like, oh my goodness, I totally understand. I get it exactly. Now, the intention of a comment like that, especially in navigating a difficult conversation, is to draw closeness. I get you, I see you, I totally understand. Now, Ronnie and I might have had some really similar experiences, but I will never totally understand, nor will Ronnie totally be able to understand, but you can totally appreciate, completely appreciate. However, to say we understand, or that we have, or I know exactly what you're saying, I have this person who did X, Y, Z, like this equating of experiences can often be quite minimizing. And so in navigating difficult conversations, one of the things that we want to do is create an environment where we can recognize that people's experiences look really different, and appreciate people say, what you said really reminds me of, or what you just said reminds me of a similar experience. I'm wondering how that experience showed up for you. So we can both create a space of connection, but without minimizing the other person's experience. Intentions versus consequences. Our intentions might be good, but that doesn't change the fact that our intentions, our consequences might be hurtful. We want to challenge a historical approach. History does absolutely matter. We cannot understand people's experiences outside of context. And so again, the first thing we said about having difficult conversations is about acquisition. And this is the same that is true here. It doesn't, sometimes folks will say, oh, that happened so long ago. It has an impact, and it might be generational. It might be that it's very relevant. It might be that someone's experiencing it very presently in their body, but we want to make sure that we create space for the context of what we're talking about and how that context is impacting the other person's ability to engage in the conversation. I have a lot of difficult conversations, and when people exhibit the highest level of defense, a lot of times it's connected to something that is well above and beyond or outside the scope of the current conversation, but that context is mattering so much in the conversation that we're having at present. We want to be consistent, to not give up with connections of people, even if we're rebuffed, to continue to go back and try. Some of you might work for agencies who do programming for particular targeted communities, or you might be trying to outreach to people. If you are developing a podcast, trying to outreach to people, and based on some aspect of your experiences or your identities, we might get pushback from folks. They may have had not so great experiences talking to people like yourself or myself, or people who work in a particular industry for that reason, for different reasons. And so consistency is so important, because we have to be just as consistent as the oppression. So we want to allow people to observe that our patterns are consistent and safe by not giving up, not, minimizing or changing our course of plan towards an equitable outcome, even if we are initially rebuffed. And then we don't want to frame other people's experiences. We want to recognize that people aren't being listened to, and ask the critical question of why, so that people can be listened to. Thoughts? Do any of these stand out to folks as things that you've seen, these tests of the privilege? Awesome. Okay. We also want to look at the tasks of the subjugated. So the tasks of the subjugated could include to overcome learned voicelessness. Now, I changed some of the language on some of the slides. This is one of the ones that I tend to change the language on as well, because in addition to the idea that the concept of how it's being used could be potentially ableist, there are people who are not able to use their voices. The context of which this is trying to convey a message is saying that there aren't people who are being listened to, and the question is why. And so many of us have been taught, not to say anything in response, or that people won't care, that not to speak unless spoken to. And so for this task of the subjugated is to really find the empowerment in communication, period, and being sure that we are bringing to the forefront issues, especially when it comes to difficult conversations. We want to exhale. People love this one because they like to physically exhale the negative messages that have become internalized. To overcome the impulse to protect, to educate, or change people. Thank you, Maya. To educate or change people, right? And to learn to deal with one's own rage, to channel it appropriate, not to eradicate it. Now, this one tends to get people stumbled up too, because when they hear the word rage, they think of like rah, rage, but it's saying that a lot of times when we have difficult conversations and we're on the subjugated end of it, we'll naturally and healthily develop protective mechanisms that don't engage particularly in that moment. But then it comes home with us, and it might have some rollover effect. It shows up in conversations with our loved ones in spaces that we're supposed to be holding as sacred or healing, or places where we feel really safe. And a lot of times it ends up staying there, as opposed to being brought back after that critical reflection or after that moment of decompression, if it's done in a positive way, to the place where the harm has occurred. And so it says, you want to be able to bring that passion back to the place where the harm potentially has occurred, or the issue has occurred, to address it in an appropriate space. And so I know that folks aren't too chatty in the group. We typically would go through and ask folks to share which tasks apply or find challenging, but I know that folks who wanted to share did share in the chat as we went through those. So I'll kind of go through some final recommendations for engaging in critical conversations, and if folks want to think about it, we can process it little bit more. Yeah, mine says in the chat, to me, this whole topic is very deep. Having conversations is so much more complex than just jumping into it. There's strategy, there's thoughtfulness, there's mindfulness to it. And especially when topics get a little bit challenging, there is informed ways to do it more productively. And it's going to look really different in our personal lives as it is in our professional lives. But ultimately, difficult conversations are difficult conversations. So the same way that, you know, these apply in training on difficult topics, it also is so helpful in one-on-one interactions where you slow down and create space to really give grace to how the conversation is being processed for different people. So what is a cue? A cue is one of the ways that your body tells you that you are in a difficult conversation. Your fingers might tingle, you might start to laugh, you might feel defensive, your heart might start to beat, your stomach might start to churn, your face might turn flushed or turn red, you might start to feel discomfort in your body. There's all these different ways that your body lets you know that you're in an uncomfortable conversation. Typically, it activates your flight response or your fight or flee or fawn response or freeze response. But ultimately, what we want to do is we want to begin to say, hey, this cue is an indicator that this is a conversation to lean into more. And sometimes I say, I feel it in my body that this is really an important topic. And then utilize that as the leverage to engage or to start that conversation. You often hear, if you did listen to the podcast, you'll hear me say, I really felt that. It's a cue, an indicator going off in the body that this is a discomforting, this is a difficult conversation, and there's more to explore here. So, yeah. Pausing for the wound. If I joined or Ronnie joined or Lee joined this session and any of us had a physical injury that you could see that was active, an active bleeding arm, for example, most folks would be like, hey, you might want to take care of that before you get this session started. And we do really good if you see someone at work who's clearly sprained their ankle, or you're having a conversation with someone who's been physically injured. We're good at pausing and saying, hey, let's take care of this need first. But when it comes to emotional wounds, we tend to not be as present, as diligent, as with as much follow through. And so one of the things that we want to do is we want to be sure to pause for emotional wounds. And when we pause for emotional wounds, one of the 3 things that we'll want to do is to breathe, to process, to inquire. Yeah, I saw your whole body language change when this topic came up. Was this bringing up for you, or, you know, is this something that you've had to process through before? Validate and acknowledge, listen to people. I'm really glad that you told me this. Yeah, that sounds really stressful. And then you'll want to address it. And address is the part that we tend to struggle with the most. This is to respond, to prevent. This can even be a challenge. So I think this is really interesting to talk about in the context of difficult conversations, because I've been in difficult conversations where the other person on the other side of the conversation is saying something and with my identities that I experience as racist, right? Or that I experience as homophobic, or that I experience as, you know, gender-based bias, or whatever that looks like. And sometimes our reactions are what they need to be in the moment, which is to protect ourselves and to remove ourselves. But if we're in a space where our goal is to engage in that difficult conversation, right? My work centers around being able to engage in those difficult conversations. I chose this life. I chose this life at work, right? So in order for me to be able to have difficult conversations where my end goal is to progress the conversation forward, fully recognizing that that's not everyone signed up for that work, not everyone chooses that work. And in that case, the best thing possible is to do whatever is most healing and protective to yourself. But if you're coming to this because you're wanting to know how to navigate difficult conversations, because you're choosing to, you know, even in those situations where I'm very activated, I still want to inquire, you know, to Ronnie's example, you brought that up. I'm wondering what you really meant by that. It sounds like that was a really negative experience for you, but I'm not going to leave it there, because my goal is to challenge it and to acknowledge it. Say, you know, that could be really hurtful or that can be really generalizing to a group of people. I'm wondering, have you considered this? And go in and not just leave it there. It's not okay what was said potentially, but it is an opportunity to address it, to recognize that someone might have said something out of hurt or pain, or maybe even complete lack of awareness, but that there are ways that we can engage the conversation to not only be continually productive, but also move towards change. We wanted to leave a couple minutes if anyone has any questions. And of course, I'll turn it to Ronnie to see if you have anything in closing. Any questions from the group? If you do have questions, of course, we have our rules to revisit, right? So you are more than welcome to reach out to Ronnie or I and follow up, or if you just want to dive in deeper to any of the topics we talked about today. Ronnie, anything from you before we close out?
I just want to say thank you to everyone for sticking with us for this past hour and engaging the ways you can. We hope that you're able to take some of this and apply it in the conversations that you have in your day-to-day lives with work or family or friends. It can be used in all those spaces, so we hope that this helps you in the future.
We'll turn it over to Lee to close this out.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Ashley and Ronnie, for presenting. I so appreciate learning this information about how we process things on the back end and how it can work for everyone as they move forward in their own professional lives. So thank you again for presenting, and thank folks for joining. As shared, today's webinar was presented in partnership with the New England MHTTC and as a SAMHSA-funded organization. We're pleased to have the opportunity to evaluate our services. So on screen right now, you'll see a link to our evaluation survey. And as well, I will grab that and put that in the chat so that folks can go ahead and give us their feedback. It's super helpful, and it allows us to provide information to SAMHSA and assist us in planning future meetings and programs. Your feedback counts. My dogs are shouting in the background, so I hope you can't hear, but attendees providing their email address will also receive the survey after the close of today's event, along with a link to a video archive and a slide presentation. And for more information about the work that we do, again, our website is right here on screen, and our email is newengland@mhtTCnetwork.org. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we hope you'll join us for another training soon. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.